It was a bright, busy morning at the local bank. People were moving in and out, carrying their papers, waiting for their turn, and chatting quietly with tellers. Among them, a young black teenager walked in holding a small notebook and a bank card. They had come to deposit some money they had been saving for months. The teenager felt a little nervous, but also proud. This was their first time handling the account on their own, and they wanted to do everything right. The bank was clean, well lit, and filled with the usual sounds of typing keyboards, printers humming, and soft conversations. The teenager walked up to the counter and politely greeted the teller. The teller smiled and nodded, asking how they could help. The teenager explained clearly, "I want to deposit this money into my account." They handed over the cash carefully, making sure it was neatly stacked. While this was happening, the bank manager, a middle-aged woman, was watching from her office across the room. She noticed the teenager and immediately felt uneasy. Something about the teenager made her suspicious, even though there was nothing unusual about their behavior. She whispered to herself, "Why is this kid here alone? I should keep an eye on them." Her eyes followed every small move the teenager made as they counted their money and filled out the deposit slip. The teenager sensed the gaze but thought nothing of it. They were focused on getting everything done correctly. They handed the slip and cash to the teller, who nodded and began processing the transaction. The teenager took a small step back and waited patiently, glancing around the bank. Other customers were quietly going about their business, some noticing the teenager, others not paying any attention at all. Suddenly, the bank manager made a decision. She picked up her phone and called the police. Her voice was calm but firm as she said something about a suspicious person in the bank. The teenager did not know what was happening at first. They noticed a few officers entering the bank a short time later. Their hearts started to race. They didn't understand why this was happening. They had done nothing wrong, yet now they were the center of attention in a way that felt terrifying. The officers approached gently but seriously. One of them spoke. "Hello, can we talk to you for a moment?" The teenager nodded, trying to stay calm, but their hands were shaking. Other people in the bank were watching now. Some whispered to each other, glancing at the teenager with curiosity or concern. The teenager felt all eyes on them, and a wave of embarrassment mixed with fear washed over them. The teller looked uncomfortable. They knew the teenager had done nothing wrong. "It's just a deposit," the teller thought. But the manager insisted that the officers speak to the teenager, saying there had been suspicious behavior. The teenager tried to explain calmly, "I just want to deposit my money. I'm not doing anything wrong." The words sounded small and fragile in the large bank hall. The police officers asked a few questions, trying to keep the situation calm. The teenager answered politely, their voice trembling slightly. Other customers were now whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others just watched silently. The tension in the room grew. The teenager could feel the fear in the pit of their stomach. They had never been treated this way before, especially not for something so ordinary and innocent. A woman in the bank, standing in line, gave the teenager a sympathetic smile. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. The teenager tried to focus on that kindness, on the thought that not everyone in the room believed the story the manager had created. But the humiliation was heavy. The teenager wondered why the manager had judged them so quickly, why the color of their skin seemed to matter more than their actual behavior. After a few minutes that felt like hours, the situation became even more tense when the manager approached the officers. She began to explain her perspective again, repeating her concerns about the teenager. Her tone was serious, and she clearly believed she was doing the right thing. The teenager's chest tightened. They wanted to speak up, but they also knew arguing might make things worse. Inside, the teenager felt a mix of confusion, fear, and anger. How could something so ordinary lead to this? They had come to the bank with good intentions, hoping to manage their money responsibly. Now they were being treated as if they had done something dangerous. The thought made them want to shrink down and disappear, but they stood as still as they could, trying to remain polite and respectful. Some customers began to murmur softly, exchanging looks that betrayed their disbelief. A few shook their heads, clearly disagreeing with the manager's actions. The teenager noticed, and it gave them a little comfort. Maybe not everyone saw them through the same lens. Maybe some people understood that they were just a young person trying to do something responsible and normal. The officers remained calm, trying to diffuse the tension. They asked for identification, which the teenager provided without hesitation. Their hands were still shaking, but they cooperated fully. Every moment felt like an eternity. Each second was heavy with the weight of unfair judgment. The teenager felt the eyes of everyone in the room and wished they could explain that they were just an ordinary kid. As the officers began to take notes and ask more questions, the teenager tried to remind themselves to breathe. They thought of home, of their family waiting for them, and of the life they wanted to lead without these kinds of interruptions. They wanted to believe that people could understand once they saw the truth. But right now, all they could do was endure the situation with as much dignity as they could muster. The tension in the bank was palpable. The manager, convinced she had acted correctly, stood by and watched closely. The teenager, on the other hand, kept their head held high despite the fear. This was a moment they would not forget. A moment that felt unfair, confusing, and painful. Yet deep down they held onto a small spark of resilience. The knowledge that they had done nothing wrong, and that one day someone would see that. After the incident at the bank, the teenager returned home with their parent. The walk back was quiet, filled with the weight of what had just happened. Every step seemed heavier than the last. The teenager's mind kept replaying the scene over and over. The manager's suspicious look, the arrival of the police, and the whispering of other customers. The feeling of being judged unfairly made their stomach ache. Once they were inside, the parent noticed immediately that something was wrong. The teenager's face was pale and their hands were trembling slightly. The parent sat them down gently, asking, "What happened at the bank?" The teenager tried to explain, their voice shaking but steady enough to tell the story. They described how the manager had watched them, called the police, and how everyone in the bank seemed to look at them differently. The parents' eyes widened, a mix of shock and anger crossing their face. They could not believe that their child, who had done nothing wrong, had been treated this way. They listened carefully, letting the teenager speak without interruption, making sure they understood every detail. "You were treated unfairly," the parent said finally. "And it is not your fault. You did everything right." The teenager nodded, but the anger and hurt inside them did not go away. They felt a sense of injustice that was hard to shake. The parent took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. This was not just about embarrassment. It was about something bigger: prejudice, bias, and the way people sometimes judge others before they even know them. The parent knew they had to do something, not just for their child, but to make sure this did not happen again. Meanwhile, word about the incident began to spread. A few neighbors and friends who knew the family heard about what happened. Some had seen the teenager at the bank and were shocked by the situation. Social media started buzzing with posts about the story. People were angry, sharing messages about racial profiling and the unfair treatment of young black people. The teenager's story struck a chord with many. People commented on how ordinary the situation was, and how wrong it had been for the manager to assume anything without reason. At home, the parent was thinking about the next steps. They wanted to make sure their child felt safe and supported. They also wanted to hold the bank accountable. The parent decided to call the bank directly, asking to speak with the manager and explain why the situation had been unacceptable. But the parent knew this conversation needed to be calm, precise, and focused on the facts. Anger would not solve the problem, but careful action could. The teenager sat nearby, watching as the parent prepared to make the call. They felt a mix of relief and nervousness. Relief because they knew their parent would handle it with strength and authority. Nervousness because they were afraid of how the manager would react. The teenager thought about how strange it felt to need a powerful adult to intervene in something that was supposed to be normal and simple: a bank deposit. As the parent made the call, they spoke clearly and calmly. They described what had happened from start to finish, emphasizing that the teenager had done nothing wrong, and that the manager's assumptions had caused unnecessary stress and humiliation. The tone of the parent's voice was firm but polite. The manager on the other end of the line seemed caught off guard, unsure how to respond at first. The teenager watched quietly, realizing that sometimes the world required adults to step in and explain fairness and justice. They thought about how, even though they had been treated unfairly, this was also a chance for people to learn and change. The parent explained that calling the police on a young person without cause could have serious consequences, and it was important for the bank to acknowledge the mistake. After the call, the parent turned to the teenager. "You have done nothing wrong," they said again. "But sometimes we have to speak up to make sure others understand what is right and wrong. Today we are speaking up, and that is important." The teenager nodded, beginning to feel a little stronger. They realized that while the incident had been painful, it was not the end of their story. They had people on their side, and that gave them hope. The next few days were filled with conversations in the community. Neighbors, friends, and even co-workers of the parent expressed their support. Some shared similar experiences, explaining how they had been judged unfairly in everyday situations. Others offered advice on handling the situation with the bank, suggesting ways to ensure accountability while keeping the teenager safe and respected. The teenager began to understand the bigger picture. This was not just about one manager or one bank. It was about the patterns of bias and unfair treatment that many people faced every day. They felt anger, yes, but also a sense of purpose. They realized that standing still and feeling humiliated was not the only option. There were ways to respond, ways to be heard, and ways to make sure this did not happen to them or anyone else again. At home, the parent worked on drafting a formal letter to the bank. The letter was polite but firm, explaining the facts of the incident, the emotional impact it had on the teenager, and the expectation for accountability and change. They planned to send it directly to the bank's head office if needed, making sure the story reached someone who could make a difference. The teenager watched this process and began to feel a sense of empowerment. They realized that while fear and embarrassment were real, so was their voice and their right to be treated fairly. They thought about the people who had shared messages of support online, the neighbors who expressed concern, and the parent who stood by them so firmly. All of this made the teenager feel that perhaps there was hope for understanding and justice. Meanwhile, the community continued to react. Some people discussed the incident openly in social media groups and community forums. Many expressed shock and disbelief that a simple visit to the bank could lead to such an unfair and unnecessary situation. Others shared stories of their own experiences, creating a larger conversation about bias, assumptions, and the need for awareness in everyday life. The teenager listened to some of these stories and felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness in hearing how often this happened to others, but also comfort in knowing that they were not alone. The parent reminded them that this was an opportunity to learn and grow. "You have seen what happens when people judge without knowing," the parent said. "Now you also see what happens when people speak up and support each other." By the end of the week, the teenager felt a small sense of relief. The immediate fear had faded, replaced by reflection and understanding. They were still upset by what had happened, but they also began to see the power of having someone who believed in you and the importance of community support. It was a lesson they would carry with them, a lesson about courage, fairness, and standing up for what is right. The incident at the bank had been humiliating and unfair, but it also became a moment of learning and growth. The teenager felt closer to their parent, who had shown strength, wisdom, and love. They realized that even when the world treated you wrongly, there were ways to respond with dignity and hope. They were no longer just a teenager at a bank. They were someone who had faced injustice and learned how to navigate it with courage and support. The parent sat quietly in the living room, thinking deeply about what had happened at the bank. Their child was nearby, flipping through a notebook but still clearly shaken. Every now and then the teenager would glance at the parent, seeking reassurance. The parent knew that the situation was serious. It was not just about embarrassment. It was about the unfair way society sometimes treats people based on assumptions and appearances. After a moment, the parent spoke gently. "You know, it's not just you who was affected today. What happened could have been much worse. People need to understand why this is wrong, and I will make sure they do." The teenager nodded, listening closely, still nervous but also feeling comforted by the parent's calm and determined tone. What the teenager did not fully realize yet was that their parent had a position of influence. They were not only a parent but also the CEO of a well-known company. This gave them resources, confidence, and the ability to address the situation in a way that could actually make a difference. The parent began planning carefully, thinking through every step they would take. It was important to act thoughtfully but also decisively. The next morning, the parent called the bank again. This time they requested to speak directly with the bank's higher management, explaining that the incident involved their child and had caused significant distress. They were calm, measured, and professional, but the underlying message was clear. The behavior of the manager was unacceptable and needed to be addressed immediately. Meanwhile, the teenager listened from another room, curious and anxious. They wondered how the situation would unfold, and if anyone at the bank would understand what had really happened. The parent explained briefly, without going into intimidating details, that they would visit the bank personally. The teenager felt a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. Knowing that their parent was going to handle the situation made them feel safe, but it also made them wonder how the manager would react. By the afternoon, the parent arrived at the bank. They entered with quiet confidence, noticing immediately the same clean, busy atmosphere the teenager had described. Customers were moving in and out, unaware that an important confrontation was about to take place. The parent walked calmly toward the manager's office, holding themselves with authority but without hostility. They were prepared to speak honestly and firmly, but also with the goal of education and understanding. The bank manager noticed the parent entering and immediately felt a jolt of recognition. Something about the presence, the calm but commanding way the parent walked, made her uneasy. She quickly realized that this was not a routine complaint. As the parent approached, she stood up, trying to maintain composure, but her voice faltered slightly. "How can I help you?" she asked, keeping her tone polite but guarded. The parent did not raise their voice. Instead, they spoke with quiet authority. "I am here because my child was treated unfairly at this bank yesterday," they began. "They came here to make a simple deposit and your manager called the police without any reason. This caused fear, humiliation, and unnecessary stress for my child." Every word was measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The manager tried to respond, but the parent continued, explaining calmly why the actions were wrong. They spoke about bias, assumptions, and the emotional impact such behavior can have on young people. "This is not just about rules or procedures," the parent said. "It's about treating people fairly and respectfully, regardless of their appearance. What happened yesterday was unacceptable." The manager grew increasingly uncomfortable. She realized that the person standing before her was not just another customer, but someone with authority, experience, and the ability to influence outcomes. Her earlier confidence, the assumption that she had acted correctly, began to crumble under the parent's calm explanation. She struggled to find words, finally murmuring an apology, though it sounded hesitant and unsure. The parent nodded slowly. "An apology is a start, but understanding and change are necessary," they said. They suggested training and awareness sessions for the staff, explaining that education could prevent this kind of mistake from happening again. They emphasized that this was an opportunity for the bank to show leadership, responsibility, and fairness. Meanwhile, the teenager was waiting outside with a friend, unaware of every detail but sensing that something important was happening. When the parent finally returned, they were greeted with a small smile from their child. "Everything okay?" the teenager asked nervously. The parent nodded. "It's done," they said. "We made sure the message was heard and the bank understands now. You were treated unfairly, but we handled it." The teenager felt a mixture of relief and pride. Relief because the fear and embarrassment of the past day had finally started to lift. Pride because they saw how their parent had used authority and wisdom to make a difference, not with anger or confrontation, but with calm, careful action. They realized that speaking up and addressing injustice could create real change when done correctly. Back at the bank, the manager was reflecting on the conversation. She understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of assumptions and bias. It was uncomfortable, but the parent had managed to explain the impact of her actions without aggression. Forcing her to confront the reality of the situation, she began to think about how she could prevent similar incidents in the future, realizing that one day's events could serve as a learning moment for the entire staff. The teenager and their parent returned home. There was a quiet sense of accomplishment and relief. The teenager felt safer and more confident, knowing that someone had stood up for them and made sure their voice was heard. They understood that while the world could be unfair, there were ways to respond that were constructive and meaningful. In the following days, the teenager began to reflect on what had happened. They thought about how the situation could have gone differently if their parent had not been there. They also realized that the power of knowledge, calm, and careful planning could be more effective than anger or confrontation. The incident, while painful, became a learning experience about resilience, fairness, and the importance of having support from people who care. The parent, meanwhile, shared the lessons learned with colleagues and friends. They emphasized how unconscious bias could lead to serious consequences and how leadership required both awareness and responsibility. They also reminded the teenager that their experience, while difficult, could become a force for positive change if approached thoughtfully. For the teenager, the sense of empowerment grew. They began to feel that even though the incident had been unjust, it had taught them important lessons. They realized that courage came in many forms, not just standing up in the moment, but also trusting others, speaking up when needed, and learning from every experience. They felt a quiet confidence that this experience, as challenging as it was, had prepared them for the future. By the end of Part 3, the story had moved from fear and confusion to action, understanding and reflection. The parents' calm authority had turned a negative experience into an opportunity for awareness, education, and change. The teenager began to see that even when the world seemed unfair, thoughtful action and support from trusted people could lead to justice, understanding, and hope. The next morning, the teenager woke up feeling a mix of nervousness and hope. The events at the bank were still fresh in their mind, and though they had started to feel stronger after their parent intervened, the thought of returning to that place brought a wave of anxiety. Their parent noticed the tension and placed a comforting hand on their shoulder. "Today we make sure it's truly resolved," the parent said gently. The teenager nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady themselves. When they arrived at the bank, the atmosphere was familiar but charged with anticipation. The parent led the way, confident and calm, while the teenager walked slightly behind, unsure what to expect. Customers moved about, unaware that a significant confrontation was about to happen. The bank manager was already present, visibly tense, waiting for the parent's arrival. She had spent the previous day reflecting on her actions, and though she knew the parent held authority, she also felt uncertainty about how the encounter would unfold. The parent approached the manager with steady steps, exuding confidence without aggression. The manager greeted them cautiously, her voice slightly faltering. "Hello, how can I help you today?" she asked, trying to maintain control. The parent didn't hesitate. "I am here because my child was treated unfairly yesterday. We need to resolve this matter completely, and I want to make sure it is understood properly." Every word was deliberate, calm, and firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The manager swallowed nervously. She knew that she had already made a mistake, and now she faced someone with authority, patience, and the ability to ensure that the issue would not be dismissed lightly. She realized the parent was not only a concerned adult, but also someone who could influence the bank's actions significantly. The gravity of the situation was undeniable, and she felt a growing unease. The parent began to explain the incident in detail. They recounted the teenager's visit, the manager's unwarranted suspicion, and the unnecessary call to the police. The parent described the emotional impact on the teenager, emphasizing the fear, confusion, and humiliation caused by the manager's actions. The parent's voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that made the manager realize the seriousness of the situation. As the parent spoke, the teenager stood quietly nearby, observing the interaction. They felt a mix of relief and nervousness. Relief, because their parent was addressing the situation with clarity and authority. Nervousness, because they still worried about how the manager would respond. The parent continued, highlighting that fairness, respect, and understanding were essential in all interactions, especially in professional spaces like a bank. The manager shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by discomfort. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the points the parent made, though it was clear she felt ashamed of her actions. The parent didn't allow the moment to linger in blame. Instead, they focused on solutions, emphasizing that the bank needed to take corrective steps to prevent similar incidents in the future. "Apologies are important," the parent said softly, "but they must be followed by real understanding. Your staff needs training on bias, and the bank should create a system to ensure no one else experiences what my child did yesterday." The manager's hands trembled slightly as she tried to respond, her mind racing to process the situation. The parent's presence and words made it clear that change was not optional. It was necessary. The teenager watched this exchange and felt a growing sense of empowerment. They realized that even though they had been unfairly judged, their parents' intervention was turning the situation into a lesson for everyone involved. They saw that change was possible when people acted thoughtfully but decisively, and that courage came not from confrontation alone but from persistence, clarity, and support. The manager finally spoke, her voice quiet and uncertain. I understand. I see now that I acted hastily and unfairly. I apologize for the distress caused. I will ensure steps are taken to prevent this from happening again. The parent nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement but reminding the manager that words needed to be backed by action. The conversation continued as they discussed specific steps, staff training, awareness programs, and revised procedures to avoid future bias. While this was happening, some bank customers glanced over, noticing the unusual seriousness of the meeting. A few had been present during the previous day's incident, and whispered to each other, exchanging looks of surprise and curiosity. The teenager felt a mix of relief and pride, realizing that their story was now being heard and respected. They were not invisible, and their experience had prompted reflection and commitment to change. After a long but constructive discussion, the parent concluded the meeting. They reiterated the importance of fairness and respect, leaving no doubt that accountability was expected. The manager nodded again, now more composed, realizing the gravity of her actions and the opportunity to learn from them. The parent turned to the teenager, offering a reassuring smile. "It's done," they said softly. The teenager exhaled deeply, feeling the tension in their chest ease for the first time. As they walked out of the bank, the teenager felt lighter. The humiliation and fear of the previous day were still present, but they were now accompanied by a sense of resolution and hope. They realized that while they had faced injustice, their voice, supported by someone they trusted, had brought understanding and change. They understood that standing up against unfair treatment could lead to meaningful outcomes. Outside the bank, the parent and teenager paused for a moment. The parent placed a hand on the teenager's shoulder. "You handled yourself well," they said. "Even in fear, you stayed calm. Remember this feeling, how it feels when justice is sought with respect and clarity. This is powerful." The teenager nodded, feeling pride mixed with relief. They were learning that resilience and dignity could transform difficult experiences into lessons of growth. Over the next few days, the teenager reflected on the events repeatedly. They thought about how quickly the situation could have escalated if their parent had not intervened, and how important it was to have support when facing unfairness. They also considered the manager's reaction, her initial discomfort, eventual acknowledgement, and willingness to take steps for change. This reflection taught the teenager about human nature, mistakes, and the potential for learning and growth even in difficult circumstances. The parent, meanwhile, followed up with the bank to ensure the promises made were implemented. They spoke to staff, provided guidance, and emphasized the importance of fairness in every interaction. The teenager observed this process quietly, understanding that change often required persistence and commitment beyond a single confrontation. They realized that addressing bias and unfairness was not about punishing individuals, but creating systems that respected everyone equally. Through this experience, the teenager also began to see their own strength. They recognized that while they had been the target of unfair treatment, their calmness, patience, and willingness to trust the process had contributed to a positive outcome. They felt more confident in facing future challenges, knowing that courage and dignity could guide them through difficult situations. By the end of Part 4, the incident at the bank had shifted from an immediate source of fear and humiliation to a moment of learning, reflection, and meaningful resolution. The teenager and parent had worked together to ensure that accountability was taken seriously, fairness was restored, and lessons were learned. What began as an ordinary bank visit had become a powerful story of courage, support, and the importance of standing up for what is right. After the confrontation at the bank, the teenager returned home feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and a lingering sense of disbelief. The fear and humiliation of the previous days had begun to fade, replaced by understanding and reflection. Sitting quietly at the kitchen table, they thought about everything that had happened: the manager's assumptions, the arrival of the police, their parents' intervention, and the eventual resolution. It had been overwhelming at times, but it had also taught them something profound about resilience, fairness, and support. The parent noticed the thoughtful expression on the teenager's face and sat down across from them. It was a difficult situation, the parent said softly. But it also shows how powerful calm action and clear communication can be. You saw that even in moments of fear, we can create change. The teenager nodded, beginning to understand the depth of what had happened. They realized that while fear could be paralyzing, knowledge, preparation, and support could transform it into empowerment. Over the next few days, word of the incident spread more widely. People in the community, neighbors, and friends discussed it openly. Many expressed shock that such an ordinary visit could turn into such an unfair experience. Some shared their own stories of being judged or treated differently because of assumptions. The teenager began to understand that their experience, while painful, was part of a larger pattern that affected many people. They felt a sense of connection with others who had faced similar situations. The teenager also reflected on the role of their parent. They realized how important it was to have someone who believed in you, someone who could advocate for you when circumstances were unfair. But beyond that, they recognized the parents' calm and thoughtful approach. They had not reacted with anger or threats. Instead, they had addressed the situation with clarity, authority, and a focus on solutions. This had led to understanding and change rather than more conflict. At school, the teenager shared a little of what had happened with close friends. They did not want to dwell on the negative aspects, but they wanted others to understand the importance of fairness and standing up for oneself. Their friends listened, asking questions and expressing concern, and the teenager felt comforted by their interest and support. It became clear that sharing experiences could help others reflect on their own behavior and assumptions. Meanwhile, the parent continued to follow up with the bank, ensuring that the commitments made during the meeting were being carried out. Staff underwent training about bias, fairness, and respectful treatment. The bank implemented new procedures to prevent similar incidents. The teenager saw that real change required more than just an apology. It required action, consistency, and accountability. Observing this process, they learned about responsibility and leadership in a tangible, real-world way. The teenager also began to think about how this experience had changed them personally. They realized that while they could not control other people's assumptions or biases, they could control their own responses. They learned how to remain calm in stressful situations, how to communicate clearly, and how to seek support when necessary. These lessons gave them a newfound sense of confidence. They understood that while unfairness exists, there are ways to respond with dignity and strength. The community's reaction continued to evolve. Some people reached out to the teenager and their family, expressing solidarity and offering words of encouragement. Others discussed the broader issue of bias in everyday life. The teenager listened and learned, beginning to see the impact of sharing experiences and speaking out. They realized that their story, though personal, could inspire reflection and change in others. At home, the parent spoke with the teenager about how to use this experience constructively. "What happened to you was wrong," the parent said. "But now we have an opportunity to help others understand why fairness matters. Your experience can teach lessons about empathy, awareness, and respect." The teenager nodded, feeling a sense of purpose. They began to understand that one event, though difficult, could become a force for education and positive change. Over time, the teenager's confidence grew. They returned to their normal routine but carried the lessons of the incident with them. They approached interactions with a greater awareness of human behavior, both the unfair and the fair. They noticed assumptions, questioned them, and practiced understanding before judgment. The experience had taught them patience, resilience, and the importance of communication. The parent also reflected on what had happened, sharing the lessons learned with colleagues, friends, and community members. They emphasized the importance of addressing bias in professional settings, being aware of assumptions, and creating systems that prevent unfair treatment. They reminded people that real change requires both education and accountability, and that leadership is about taking responsibility for fairness and equity. For the teenager, the incident became a defining moment, not because it had been easy or pleasant, but because of the growth it inspired. They understood that life would not always be fair, and people would sometimes make assumptions or judgments based on appearances. But they also understood that with support, clarity, and courage, these situations could be addressed and transformed into opportunities for understanding and growth. In the weeks that followed, the teenager continued to reflect on the experience. They realized how important it was to remain aware of both their own actions and the actions of others. They began to consider ways they could contribute to a more fair and understanding community. even in small ways, such as speaking out against unfair treatment or supporting peers who faced bias. The parent noticed the teenager's growing maturity and confidence and felt a quiet sense of pride. They knew that this experience, while painful, had taught lessons that could last a lifetime. They encouraged the teenager to share what they had learned with others, not in anger, but in a way that promoted understanding, empathy, and fairness. The teenager also thought about the manager at the bank. While initially judgmental and hasty, the manager had listened, acknowledged the mistake, and committed to change. The teenager reflected on the importance of giving people the chance to learn from their mistakes. They understood that understanding, education, and accountability could turn a negative experience into a positive outcome for everyone involved. By the end of this experience, the teenager felt a sense of closure and empowerment. What had started as a frightening and humiliating encounter had become a story of growth, reflection, and change. They had learned about resilience, fairness, courage, and the power of support. They understood that even in a world that can be unfair, there are ways to seek understanding, create change, and make a difference. This experience also left a lasting impression on the community and the people around them. Discussions about fairness, bias, and empathy continued, and the bank's new practices became a small but meaningful step toward more equitable treatment of customers. The teenager realized that even one event could ripple outward, influencing others and encouraging reflection, awareness, and positive change. Finally, the teenager and their parents sat together, reflecting quietly. They spoke about what had happened, what had been learned, and how these lessons could be applied in the future. The teenager felt a sense of peace and confidence, knowing that they had faced injustice, witnessed accountability, and learned the power of calm, thoughtful action. They understood that while life might continue to challenge them, they were better prepared to face it with courage, dignity, and hope.